Right. Billahi Rabbil Alameen. That many people are showing up today. No, they're coming in. Alrighty. Welcome everybody to session number 21 of our slow reading of the Bezels of Wisdom. This has been a very interesting week for me. I hope it was an interesting week for you. Want to start by kind of continuing something I said last week towards the end of that session, and that was about the comment that Hossein Jaffrey made, asking about, what is special about Jesus. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to say about that. One is that I would also kind of temper my own last comment about what I said by saying that when we say what is special about someone, when we're talking about one of the mustafin, one of the chosen ones, we also have to look at that question from the prism of the Tahlil itself, the La ilaha illallah, because there's obviously a dialectic. So I said that Jesus, there was nothing special about Jesus from one angle, but then from another angle, he is, Isa ibn Maryam, Ruhullah. And this other angle would be the element of the illallah. So if the nothing is the la ilaha, then what is special about Jesus is the ithbat, the affirmation, his subutiya, which is also a concept or a word that is tied to the notion of the ayan thabita, the immutable archetypal essences. So if we look at the question of non-being and being, and apply it to this specialness of Jesus, then I think the Tahlil can guide us itself as to the answer to that question, because all of these questions, all of these issues, on the one hand, can be an either or proposition, but from another angle are both and simultaneously. So I hope that kind of wraps up that particular angle of the question that Hossein Jaffrey asked. And so let us now move to the last part of this chapter of Jesus, which is one of the more central chapters of this book. And where I left off, let me begin from where I left off. So the elements are a form of nature, just as that which is above them and what they generate, which is the sublime spirits that are above the seven heavens. As for the spirits of the seven heavens and their essences, deriving as they do from the smoke, they the elements generate, they, as also the angels, which also come into being from each heaven, are elemental. This is a very important point and subtle point of Ibn Arabi's metaphysics. But what you have to understand here is that when he's saying they're elemental, he's not saying they're material. Because as far as he is concerned, when we are talking about tabi'a kulliya, the universal nature both sustains a spiritual reality as well as a material reality simultaneously. And whereas here he is kind of, putting things in a very condensed form, when he gets into a discussion about the nature of universal matter, the Hayullah, in his Futuhat al-Makkiyah, a lot of what he means by the angels and certain of the spirits in the plural being elemental get very better fleshed out in what he's saying. Now, although Ibn Arabi himself is not known for the proposition of reverse hylomorphism, which is a central element of the Shaykhi school, but also, interestingly enough, it was a element of earlier Ismaili metaphysics, where sometimes you find some of these early Ismaili thinkers subscribing to this reverse hylomorphism, where universal matter precedes the forms. So Prakriti is before Purusha. I think those are the right terms in the tantric terminology. Ibn Arabi is also subtly trying to suggest something very similar. This is a very thorny issue, and I have debated this with several different Akbarians who have, either some of them have agreed with me and others of them have disagreed with me, but without coming and actually making a axiom about, what the nature of hylomorphism is. When one reads Ibn Arabi carefully, it appears that when he makes these propositions about the spirits being elemental beings, and that the elemental nature of things, because of its occurrence in universal nature, is both spiritual and element and material simultaneously, this seems to suggest that Ibn Arabi is subscribing to a very similar Shaykhi reverse hylomorphism as compared to some of his successors, who basically took on the basic Aristotelian hylomorphic scheme, and other schools, who basically believe that form precedes matter. But there's an interesting angle here that, if you think about it, if you are proposing the unity or the unicity of being, wahdat al-wujud, even if you're not using the term, if you propose reverse hylomorphism in that matter precedes form, you are a wahdat al-wujudist. You are coming from the position of the isalat al-wujud, the primacy of being. Whereas if you assert the opposite of this and say that form or mahiyat, the quintessence, or the quiddities precede their substrates or the matter, then you are saying the opposite of this. But Ibn Arabi, in my opinion, appears to be holding to a form of reverse hylomorphism without coming out and saying so. Now, he says, these angels are elemental, while the ones above them are of nature or universal nature. It is for this reason that God has described them, that is, the heavenly host, as being in conflict, nature itself being self-contradictory. Indeed, it is the breath that has brought about the mutual conflict among the divine names, which are relationships. Consider, however, how the divine essence, which is beyond this regime of conflict, is characterized by utter self-sufficiency, beyond all need of the cosmos. Because of this, the cosmos has been set forth in the form of its creator, which is nothing other than the divine breath. To the extent, and this, we can take the Nafas al-Rahmaniyya as kind of a correspondent to the universal matter itself, the Hayula Kulliya. To the extent that it is hot, it is high, while to the extent that it is cold and moist, it is low. According as it is dry, it is fixed and does not move, since precipitation relates to cold and moisture. Consider how the physician, when he wishes to prescribe a potion for a patient, looks first at the sedimentation of the urine. When he sees that it's precipitating, he knows maturation is complete and prescribes the medicine to accelerate the cure. It only precipitates because of his natural moisture and coldness. God needs this human clay in his two hands, which, although both are right hands, are nevertheless in opposition. This is no concealing the difference between them, if it is only that they are two separate hands, since naught influences universal nature except what conforms to her, and she is polarized. So he came forth with two hands. When he created him, that is Adam with two hands, he called him Bashar, mortal human, because of the direct connection, mubashara, suggested by the two hands ascribed to him. Thus, or this he did out of concern for this humankind, saying to the one who refused to prostrate himself before him, what restrained you from prostrating before him whom I have created with my two hands? Are you too proud to do so? That is, before one who is elemental like yourself? Or are you one of the sublime ones, al-aluna? By the epithet sublime, he means one who in his luminous makeup is beyond the elementals, although he is natural. Man's only superiority over other creatures is in his being a bashar, a mortal human. For in this respect, he is superior to all things created without that connection, mubashara, the divine presence. Thus, man ranks above the terrestrial and celestial angels, while God has stipulated that the sublime higher angels are superior to mankind. Whoever wishes to know the divine breath, then let him first know the cosmos. For he who knows himself knows his Lord, who is manifest in him. In other words, the cosmos is manifested in the divine breath by that which God relieved the divine names from the distress they experienced by the non-manifestation of their effects. Thus he bestows favor on himself by what he creates in his breath. Indeed, the first effect of the breath is experienced only in the divine presence, after which it continues its descent by universal process of release down to the last thing to be created. All is essentially in the breath, as light is in essence in the dark before dawn. Knowledge of this by intellectual proof is like the emergence of daylight to one half asleep. He perceives what we speak of in a way that gives him a clue to the breath. What I say relieves him of anxiety. As he recites the chapter, he frowned. It manifests itself to him who comes seeking a coal from its fire. He sees it as fire, but it is a light to kings and nightfarers. When you understand what I'm saying, you will know that you are indigent. Had he, Moses, sought after that, a fire, he would have seen it in it, and not inversely. When the reality addressed himself this word of Jesus in the station of until he knows, although he knows well, he asked him whether it was true or not that certain things had been attributed to him, knowing full well that what had transpired, saying, did you say to the people, take me and my mother as gods rather than God? Now, courtesy requires that the questioner be given an answer, since when he reveals himself to him in this station and this form, wisdom dictates that the answer be given from the standpoint of distinction between speaker and the one spoken to, but with the reality of the synthesis clearly in view. Jesus replied, emphasizing the divine transcendence, may you be exalted, stressing the you, a word that implies encounter and dialogue. It is not for me, that is for me rather than you, to say that I have no right to say. That is what my identity might require, but not my latent essence. If indeed I said such a thing, you know of it because you are the true speaker, and one who utters a statement knows what he is saying. You, therefore, are the tongue by which I speak, as the apostle has told us of his Lord with respect to divine communication. I am his tongue by which he speaks. Thus does he make his identity the same as the tongue of the speaker, attributing the speech to the servant. Then his devoted servant completes the reply, saying, you know what is in my soul, the speaker being in essence God, but I do not know what is in it as form. He denies to Jesus his own identity, but not as speaker or as possessor of creative effect. Then he says, surely you, using a reinforcing pronoun to emphasize and confirm the following declaration, seeing that none knows the unseen except God. Thus, in his reply, he distinguishes and synthesizes, singularizes and pluralizes, broadens and narrows. Then he says, completing the answer, I told them only what you commanded me to say. So indicating by denial what was he who said it. The uttering of the reply requires a certain courtesy toward the inquiry. Had he not answered at all, he would have been considered devoid of all knowledge of the realities, which is, of course, quite untrue of him. His saying only what you commanded me to say is as if to say you are the speaker on my tongue, and you are in truth my very tongue. Consider then how precise and subtle is this divine and spiritual intimation. So I said, worship God. He uses the name Allah because of the variety of worshipers and their acts of worship and the different religious traditions. He does not use one of the particular names, but rather that name which includes them all. Then he goes on to say, my Lord and your Lord, since it is certain that his relationships with one creature as Lord is not the same as with another. For that reason, he makes the distinction between my Lord and your Lord, referring separately to the speaker and the one spoken to. When he says, only what you commanded me to say, he lays the stress on himself as being commanded, which is his servanthood. Since a command is only given to one who, it is supposed, will comply, whether he does so or not. Since the command descends according to the regime of ranks, everything manifested in a particular rank is affected by what is afforded it by the reality of that rank. The rank of the ordered has a regimen that is apparent in everything ordered, just as the rank of commanding has a regimen apparent in everyone who commands. When God says establish prayer, he's at once the commander and the one who obliges. Just a second. All right, once again. When God says establish prayer, he's at once the commander, the one who obliges, and the commanded. When the servant prays, "Oh my Lord, forgive me," he is the commander, while the reality is the commanded, for what God requires of his servant by his command is the same as that which the servant requires of the reality by his command. For this reason, one might say that every supplication is inevitably responded to, even if it be delayed. For instance, certain people under obligation, when commanded to pray, might not pray at that time, but postpone compliance by praying at another time, although they're quite capable of praying at the time. Thus, response is inevitable, even if only by intention. Then he says, I am concerning them, not concerning myself together with them, as when he said, my Lord and your Lord, a witness so long as I remain with them. This is because the prophets bear witness concerning their communities while they are with them. He continued, and when you caused me to die, that is when you raised me to yourself, hiding them from me and me from them. You were the watcher over them, not in my material substance, but in theirs, since you were their sight, which required supervision. Man's consciousness of himself is indeed God's consciousness of him, but he, Jesus, has attributed the consciousness to the name the watcher, referring the consciousness to him. He wishes thereby to distinguish between himself and his Lord, so that he may know that he is himself a servant and that God is himself as his Lord, considering himself as witness and God as the watcher, or shahid, the witness. Thus, in relation to himself, Jesus puts his people first, saying concerning them, a witness while I am with them, preferring them out of courtesy. He places them last, however, when speaking of God in saying the watcher over them, since the Lord is deserving of precedence. Then he shows that God, the watcher, bears also the name that he used of himself when he said concerning them, a witness. He says, you are the witness of everything, the word every denoting generality, and the word thing being the most unspecific of words. That is because he is the witness of everything that is witnessed, according as the reality of that thing dictates. So showing that it is, in fact, God who is the witness concerning the people of Jesus and is saying, I was a witness concerning them while I was with them. This is the witnessing of God in the substance of Jesus, having confirmed that he was his tongue, hearing, and sight. God speaks of a word of Jesus and a word of Muhammad. As for a being of Jesus, it is because it is the utterance by God of God's communication concerning him in his book. As for its being of Muhammad, it is because it happened to Muhammad in a particular place. He spent the whole night repeating it and nothing else until the breaking of dawn. If you chastise them, then they are your servants. But if you forgive them, then you are the mighty, the wise. The word them, as also with the word he, is a pronoun of absence. He also says, it is they who disbelieve, using the third person pronoun, the absence veiling them from what is meant by the Gnostics, by the witnessed one who is present. He says, if you chastise them with the pronoun of absence, which is not but the veil that hides them from God. He therefore reminds them of God before their presence on the last days, so that when they are present, the leaven may gain control in the dough and make it easy itself. For they are your servants, using the singular pronoun because of the unity by which they exist. There is no abasement greater than that of slaves, seeing they have no freedom of action with respect to themselves. Their lot is determined by what their master wants with them, and he has no associate in what concerns them. As he says, your servants with a singular pronoun. By chastisement is meant their abasement, and there's none more abased than they because they are slaves. That they are abased is determined by their essences. He means you do not abase them any more than their state of servitude requires if you forgive them. That is, if you shield them from the befalling of punishment they deserve by their contention, or make a covering for them to shield them from it and avert it from them. You are the mighty, the averter, the protector. When God bestows this name on one of his servants, he himself is called the strengthener, al-Mu'iz, with the recipient, while the recipient is called the mighty, al-Aziz. Thus God, as protector, guards against the wishes of God, the avenger, the chastiser. As per the very famous prayer, A'udhu billahi min Allah, I take refuge in God from God. Here also he uses a reinforcing pronoun to make things clear, the verse being of the same kind, as is saying, surely you are the knower of the unseen things, and surely you were the watcher over them. He also says, surely you are the mighty, the wise. The words, if you chastise them, if you forgive them, became an urgent question for the Prophet Muhammad, which were repeated all night until daybreak, seeking an answer. Had he received the answer immediately, he would have gone on repeating the question. God, for his part, set out for him in detail all the reasons for their being punished, and at each one he would say to God, if you chastise them, then they are your servants, but if you forgive them, then surely you are the mighty, the wise. Had he perceived in what was set forth to him any reason to take God's side, he would have pleaded against them rather than for them. God set forth to him what they deserved, to emphasize the submission to God and the exposure to his forgiveness set out in this verse. It is said that when God likes the voice of his servant in his supplication to him, he postpones the response so that he might repeat it, not out of any aversion, but out of love for him. So he is called the wise and the wise one. And the wise one is he who apportions things to their proper places and does not deviate concerning them from what their realities through their attributes dictate and require. Thus the phrase, the wise, the knowing, al-Hakim, al-Alim, is in the proper order, which the Prophet reiterates in accordance with a profound knowledge from God Most High. Whoever recites it should do so in this manner or remain appropriately silent. When God befits a servant to give expression to some matter, he does so only that he might respond to him and fulfill his need. Therefore, let no one think that what he has been made fit for is late in coming. Let him rather emulate the zeal of God's apostle in respect of this verse in all his states, so that they may hear with his inner or outer hearing, or in whatever way God may cause them to hear. His response, if God blesses you with the physically expressed request, he will cause you to hear his response with the physical ear. But if he blesses you with an inner request, then he will cause you to hear his response inwardly. And that was the chapter of Jesus. Okay. Floor is open. Questions, queries, revelations.
I guess I have a question. Or I don't know if this is really a question, more like a comment. Or made for some kind of clarification when he discusses the whole, there's no abasement greater than that of slaves, seeing they have no freedom of action with respect to themselves. And then he says that, their chastisement is meant their abasement, and that there's none more based than they because they are slaves, and that they are based is determined by their essences.
Mhm.
Essentially, like, kind of, this is, I don't know if this is like some sort of commentary on the whole, because you find this very often in, mainstream Islamic discourse, like, oh, we're slaves of Allah, I'm happy to be a slave of Allah. I don't know
Mm.
if he's like kind of like commenting on that here, because that's what it appears to me to be, and that he's kind of um like elucidating what that actually means in a higher context, like that there is an essence, like part of their, I guess, their archetypal essence is like determined towards that, but at the same time that it's like I guess, a dialectical relationship, because they are they're commanding themselves to be abased, and then that's, the command is part of the commander, and like he says earlier, essentially. I don't know if that's something you agree with.
Yeah, of course.
Um,
I mean, that's the logic. What he's saying. Just bear in mind that everywhere where he is personifying the immutable archetypal essences in the form of the abd, the servant or slave, right? These are just examples because he's ultimately speaking of the immutable archetypal essences themselves, right? So, and which, the abd in any kind of a personification is literally the instantiation of, right? Me, you, everything else, okay? But by the same token, in their non-being, every last one of these immutable archetypal essences is the knowledge of God itself. Hence, that dialectic of he, not he, huwa la huwa, right? Or the tahlil, which is the way I always phrase it, the la ilaha illallah. Okay, so this has to be taken into consideration. I mean, mainstream Islamic theological discourse, as also with mainstream Judaism and Christianity and others, are not going to be able to get their head around such a dialectic, right? Because the dialectic is really about um, the oscillation of consciousness, right, between non-being and being, right? So non-being is the dependent, the iftiqar, while being is the opposite of that, right? Which is why, elsewhere and leading up to this chapter and also subsequent to this chapter, the issue of the Lord and what that means is so paramount. And as we established earlier in a couple of chapters ago, whenever without qualification Ibn Arabi is speaking of Rabb, he's not speaking about Rabbil Alameen. He's speaking about the individual Lord of each created thing, which is another way of saying their immutable archetypal essence. But by the same token, that immutable archetypal essence as a content of intelligible knowledge in the mind of God is also simultaneously the Rabbil Alameen. Okay, by that relationship alone. So this Abd Rab dynamic, and especially in the way that Ibn Arabi is the exampling that he's giving in that particular chapter that you put your finger, paragraph that you put your finger on just now, is doing precisely what you're saying. It's doing. It is on the one hand, it's a very ingenious way that he addresses these things, because when he begins a particular paragraph, it appears that he's validating a very mainstream notion of this. And then as one proceeds deeper into the reasoning of the paragraph, you see that he's actually, dismantling and deconstructing that whole contextual understanding of what this is completely. So that by the time we're at the end of the paragraph, you're just kind of like that you were in bewilderment. And what just happened here? He started off, saying, this is the axiom, and then as we proceed further into the paragraph, the axiom just unravels, and you see something else completely different at the end of that paragraph of what the nature of ubudiyah actually is. So this is what needs to be taken on board whenever you read these sorts of passages in the Fusus. In the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, he has a lot more, because he has a lot more room, obviously, 560 chapters. Because he has a lot more room and there's a lot more examples and, things of that nature that he's putting forward, he kind of has more of a legroom, as it were, to put the microscope on each individual one of these issues, to break them down for us to understand what this unity of being actually entail. But even in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, I mean, there are statements made in it that, any Orthodox exoteric religionist looks at and just screams in utter horror. Because what Ibn Arabi is doing is he's taking the elements of the received orthodoxy and just completely gutting them of their, I would call, toxic substances, or just dissecting it. And then by the end of this process, you actually see something else. But the point of this kind of method is, is basically to demonstrate the transparency of every conceivable form of manifestation, including in the various relationships of these manifestations to God. That the ultimate subject of everything that we are talking about is Allah, is the one, is the real Allah.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. And the interesting thing is that he never like he takes these concepts, he never really deviates, like he never goes into a completely antinomian direction where he just says, all this stuff is, not for the true Gnostic. He actually retains the essence of the,
Yeah.
exoteric command, and then he, breaks it down, and then you can never really say that he killed it. He just kind of like made it, like resurrected it, I guess, if to bring it back to the
Well, yeah,
yeah.
yes and no. I mean, I agree with what you said. That's exactly what he's doing. But on the other hand, I've thought about this for so many different years after reading so much of Ibn Arabi. And I am firmly of the mind that this was just a method, that if we were to resurrect Ibn Arabi today with the knowledge of the last 800, almost 900 years, he would probably, if he was in a safe environment, speak with a lot more plainness and openness than this kind of obfuscatory kind of manner that 900 years ago, if he kind of pushed the envelope a little harder, they would have killed him, as they tried to several times with the fatwas that these Hanafis and Hanbalis passed against him. So yes and no, I would say to that. Yes, this is what he was doing, and he does, and the method is just pristine. It's just so well executed that if one is reading Ibn Arabi carefully, it is very difficult to try to lay any kind of heresy at his foot. Although at the same time as one is saying it, the things that he does actually conclude with in arguments just completely undermine the very received orthodoxies of the faith. This is why some of Ibn Arabi's most gushing admirers in the generations after him, amongst the various Sunni establishment, were saying that reading Ibn Arabi is not for everybody, that you shouldn't read Ibn Arabi until you have progressed and mastered the laws and the sciences and all of that, and then only then, if you're prepared, should you even look at Ibn Arabi, which is quite a statement, because no one says this about the Quran, right? That the Quran, that you shouldn't approach the Quran and read it until you're sufficiently trained in the intricacies of Arabic and theology to understand it. But this was the caveat for Ibn Arabi, that they were not allowing people. This was like the most verboten book for any novice to forge, whether it would be the Fusus, al-Hikam, or even the Futuhat al-Makkiyah. So this says something about Ibn Arabi, that certain people recognize that this guy was not only out there, but that what he is saying is beyond the conventional norms and boundaries that orthodoxy can possibly entertain, even though the guy was very deliberately crafting and masking every last element of what he was saying within the bounds of that orthodoxy, which makes him an absolute genius in every regard.
Yeah, I agree, especially in the Fusus, because when it comes to like the denunciations of him, like from what I read online, like 90% of the quotes that they use to call him, a kafir, they come from the Futuhat. They don't actually
Yeah.
come from the Fusus. They're like, because the Fusus, I guess, is like kind of, for them, it's like impenetrable for them to be able to like
Well,
quote line and say, oh,
the
he's that. Yeah.
Fusus is impenetrable even to the best of the Gnostics. I mean, hence this massive commentary tradition of it, where officially, we know that there's about a little over 100 commentaries penned on the Fusus al-Hikam. Sayyid Nizam ad-Din Ahmad, based on his own research in these various manuscript libraries in Turkey, in this latest one of his latest podcasts that he made about Ibn Arabi, thinks that this number may just swells way beyond that, that we're possibly talking in the thousands. And this is including, like, for example, the Urdu commentaries in the various, libraries in the subcontinent, many Persian commentaries, commentaries in other languages. I mean, I know Sachika Murata and William Chittick mentioned their knowledge about certain Chinese commentaries amongst the Chinese Muslims on the Fusus al-Hikam. So this book was extremely influential, and because of its enigmatic nature and its enigmatic forms of expression, just elicited this, this commentary tradition and this interest from a variety of people, especially from the Sufi milieu of the Islamic world everywhere. Malay commentaries that have been claimed to exist, these are all there. Yeah, so this is a book in many ways for the kind of the literate Islamic population up until maybe 100 or so years ago, that after the Quran itself was one that was very deeply contemplated by Muslims everywhere and in all of the denominations, Sunni, Shia, etc. Because one thing, and Sayyid Nizam Ahmad once said to me, he said, this whole Sunni Shia thing about Ibn Arabi on one level is beside the point, because he's all of them simultaneously. He's one of the weirdest amongst the Sufi awliya that is not, that you cannot pin down in that, because he says something in one place that, you're just like, this guy is absolutely a Shia doing taqiyya, but then he says something else somewhere else where just that completely would unravel that, and so on and so forth. From my point of view, there are, and Nizam also agrees with this, the crypto Shiism of Ibn Arabi is extremely pronounced, but he was not a Shia officially, but on another level, that doesn't even matter when we're talking about this guy, because if you want to put it this way, his project, as it were, was striving to encompass the totality of the Islamic discourses as a whole. That what Ibn Arabi, in essence, was kind of attempting, and I think he succeeded, is a grand synthesis of all of the doctrines of his time within this larger metaphysical framework of Wahdat al-Wujud, without even using that term, right? And that is why, if you approach Ibn Arabi from a sectarian perspective, you can get very easily lost. So, what really clicked for me many years ago about Ibn Arabi is that with Ibn Arabi, one has to literally take that formula of alchemy, solva e coagula, dissolve and bring together. You have to take that as a literal method in understanding what he's doing. Because, and especially when you're reading the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, because he is drawing from every conceivable Islamic science in existence of his time and putting them all, every last element of it, to an analysis of Wahdat al-Wujud. Which is what makes that particular book both so unique and also so daunting at the same time. Because unless you have some kind of even a moderately cursory knowledge of each of these various branches of the Islamic sciences that he's talking about, you can get lost very quickly in reading the Futuhat.
Yeah, just from this chapter, two things that I picked up, and I haven't, obviously, I'd have to study more to get into it, but he does gloss on the whole, microcosm, macrocosm again, which he already did earlier in the book, and he does bring in this, like, I guess, this sort of like analogy from, the sort of Galenic inspired medicine with the whole urine, and that goes back, also links from Galen to alchemy in general, and of course the Aristotelian active and passive qualities, hot, cold, wet, dry, that stuff. So yeah, there's a lot here. It's very interesting.
Well, one thing, let's like, for example, let's look at this enigmatic nature on this one element of this particular chapter, and that's the birth of Jesus. If you read the Fusus al-Hikam without any other commentary, right, it is possible to interpret Ibn Arabi's conclusion about this event in many different ways. But other than maybe one or two commentators, the rest of the commentators are basically, trying to formulate Ibn Arabi's view within the boundaries of the Islamic orthodoxy. That basically these very complex arguments about the imagination are just Ibn Arabi's way of trying to validate the orthodox narrative about the birth of Jesus. But when you read Ibn Arabi carefully, right, it is not apparent at all. And if you follow the logic, this logic can take you to several very interesting places, like one of which I touched on last week, that Ibn Arabi's own reasoning is not obviating the possibility of the appearance of the Ruh al-Amin in an imaginal form within the human form of Joseph, right? And the verse that actually identifies what Gabriel was, basically calls Gabriel Basharan Sawiyan, right? A incomparable human form, right? So an incomparable human form in an imaginal form can also be argued to be someone who is in a state of in rapture, of ecstasy, spiritual ecstasy. They have experienced khalsa within their being. Suddenly their nafs is gone. They're in a state of utter God intoxicated rapture. And that can happen to anybody. That can happen to you. That can happen to me. That can happen to anybody. So this narrative is not as straightforward as many think it is, whether in the Quran, in the literal text of the Quran, or in the way that Ibn Arabi is interpreting it. But his commentators kind of make it out to be, he's Muhyiddin is just basically, just finessing this Quranic narrative with the context of the active imagination. Yes, he is doing that, but the conclusion from this is a lot more subtle and nuanced than they're even giving him credit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't know. I really, that is something I couldn't understand how they could get that idea that this is like just, I mean, it's definitely
Well,
not just a simple,
look, something that Cloud Adas says in her biography of Ibn Arabi that has really irritated me about her for the last 20, 30 years. She and her father, who come from a very specific school of interpreting Ibn Arabi, kind of blame Sadruddin Qunawi and the rest of the commentators and the rest of the Akbarian tradition for labeling this term Wahdat al-Wujud because it made Ibn Arabi open to the charges of heresy, etc. My point of view is like, well, so what? No matter what Ibn Arabi was going to say, in whatever context he said it, even if they had not termed what he's saying as Wahdat al-Wujud, these sticklers would have, stickled anyway. So what is, why blame Qunawi and this later tradition and his students, Faragani, etc., for labeling it and then opening Ibn Arabi to the attacks of the Orthodox? The Orthodox are ignoramuses, the exotericists. No matter, if you talk from a level of sublimity, they're always going to attack you. And Ibn Arabi is about, opening and just basically smashing the boundaries that keep our vision of beholding and witnessing the real in its massive panorama. That's what he's about. He's about taking down all the veil. Witness the beauty in his panorama, right? So what has happened is that one section of this greater Akbarian tradition has gone out of his way to try to assert and prove the orthodoxy of Ibn Arabi, that this became the overriding agenda. And what Cloud Adas, and then later her father in his two books, Ocean Without a Shore and The Seal of Saint, are echoing is this concern that if we don't assert Ibn Arabi's orthodoxy, then he's going to be washed away by this, sea of condemnation by these Salafists, etc. My opinion is, excuse my French, fuck them. It's as simple as that. If they cannot, a Gnostic should not be dependent on what these Neanderthals are thinking. If you are expressing a truth beyond the boundaries, beyond some kind of an acceptable boundary, well, that is the way that expression comes out. And the issue of its heterodoxy and orthodoxy is really tangential, especially since these boundaries of what is orthodox and heterodox themselves are continually shifting from one age to the next. What is acceptable is not acceptable in another age. Sometimes there's even a shift back and forth between the two, that what was acceptable in one age is not accepted in a later age. We see this, for example, in the majoritarian milieu of Sunnis today, where up until 150 years ago, when Sufism was the normative kind of expression of Sunnism, today it has become the minority one, with these mentally ill Salafists and followers of Ibn Taymiyyah and Wahhabis, etc., dominating the scene with their nonsense, and are calling everything not bolted down shirk. Everything to them is association. Even anything, is that does not occur with what their mashayikh, what their sheikhs have written on paper, to them is a form of kufr and association. And that's basically a kind of in my opinion, a form of shirk itself. But anyway, that's the issue. So these people have always been concerned in asserting Ibn Arabi's orthodoxy about, beyond everything else. And from my point of view, that doesn't even matter. The truth is not bound to the perception of the correctness or incorrectness of the observer. It is the truth. As simple as that. What occurs to the perception of people as to its goodness or badness is relative to their own standpoint, not what the truth is in its totality.
I agree. And, it's unfair for one side to accommodate to the other, but the other is not expected to accommodate to you even. So even from that perspective, it doesn't really
Yeah.
make sense. But yeah, that's all. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Go for it.
I wanted to try and clarify the elemental thing a bit more.
Sure.
So I'll just sort of talk you through what came to mind. I thought of there was these Quechuan elders that I learned from some years ago, and they talked about like that water and fire, like the elements themselves, they're beings. They're like beings.
Yeah.
And from what I've seen, I can think of two examples that I feel illustrate how there's a dual direction, where there are these elemental blueprint kind of things, like when I stayed on Wollumben and I saw all these they were sort of like astral blueprints coming out of the volcano from space. That's what I was shown, that the blueprints were coming through from space to Earth, and they were all these, like, they looked like like Fibonacci spirals. And lots of so they look like they were like the blueprints for all sorts of life, basically like early life. So that was like one, because I try to relate these concepts to things I've seen agnostically, obviously. But then there's another example where there was a friend who was kind of skeptical of anything psychic, and I woke up in the night and I'd had this I was like, there's this monster in the room, and there's this very particular looking monster with this snouty tentacle thing, and everything I was using, I was trying to get rid of it, didn't work. And then when I spoke to the friend, he said that and he was many miles away, he'd been watching this TV show, right, with this exact monster in it. And I kind of thought, oh, maybe I couldn't get rid of it because it wasn't really a real being as such, but like a kind of thought form. And I felt that it happened to help him understand, to help dismantle his skepticism, because people, without direct experience, they're skeptical. And so I feel like there are these elemental things, in the creation, but then there's also perhaps things that we create with our consciousness that become kind of like, I get, the word I'm looking for is maybe like egregores or something
Oh yeah,
like
sure.
that.
Yeah.
So, like, do you think there's any
Look,
validity in that? What do you think?
yeah, of course. Look, I talked about, universal matter, the hayula, the hule. If you take the universal matter as animate consciousness on one level, right?
Mhm.
Within this matrix of animate consciousness, um, all things that are produced are fundamentally produced at their basis from mind within that substrate of the universal animate consciousness. So whether you say that such a thing is a projection of mind or not amounts to saying the same thing. So if it is an instantiation that occurs in a particular receptacle of that mind, Gabin, which is yourself at any given moment, then you can see how this is a projection of someone's mind being projected at you or yours to somebody else, right? But if it occurs within another receptacle that you are not immediately connected to, then the mind will try to rationalize some kind of an independent existence for this entity or thing outside of this animate universal matrix of universal matter that you yourself are a part of.
Is
And
that the
this
bit
is,
where I'm going, oh, that's just not,
yeah,
it's a fictional thing, but you're
well,
saying it's
no,
still,
no,
the
no, no, no,
monster
no.
was a fictional
No,
thing,
I'm just
but it's
saying
still
that
from mind?
I'm saying that both these categories of fiction and nonfiction at that level are actually relevant,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Because from within that, as he says right at the beginning of the very first chapter of the Fusus al-Hikam, about the nature of necessity, the possible and the impossible. The position that Ibn Arabi is saying is that everything that is intelligible, everything that can be thought, let alone everything that concretely exists, is necessary by virtue of the necessary being with it, which is God. Meaning that if you can think something, right? If you can think of a square circle, that thing possesses potential existence and is necessary by virtue of the existence of it. So it is in essence, that is a sort of like an archetype that is being thought through you, as it were, within this infinite matrix of universal matter, right? Which is tenebrous and subtle at the same time. So the question as to whether this is real concretely or a fantasy from this level of analysis is a relevant question. Because from this level of the equation, everything is possible that can be thought, right?
Had,
And
had,
this is
yeah,
also
sorry.
what I have been trying to very, subtly instill on that theurgy list that people don't seem to get, the majority of the people, that all this talk about jinn and possession, whatnot, these are all occurring within this stream that I'm talking about. That their mind is part of that stream. That if they want, but then by the same token, they are free at any time to swim in another stream and not believe themselves to be possessed and cursed by these generational curses or jinn or whatever. This is a very subtle thing, and it takes experience, that's the suluk and the tasting, to really understand how it works, because it defies languaging in many ways. So you have to basically taste it, but I wouldn't dismiss your experience as being a fantasy, right? Particularly as when people are getting deeper and deeper into their path, as as they get deeper, there are phenomena that are constantly occurring that defy logical explanation, that are things that happen in a intelligible form, but then manifest in a concrete reality in front of them. I mean, that experience I had with that Turkish woman that then constitutes the narrative behind my Card of Eve for the Nur Tarot is a classic example of this. There have been a lot more of these throughout this last year that have gone by. So that then becomes my gauge about how I am getting deeper into my own path. And rather than, fall into several different traps when these sorts of coincidences or synchronicities happen, where either you get a big head about it, thinking you're special, or it scares the hell out of you, rather than fall into any of these traps, you take these things as confirmation that you are on the right track, and then to go deeper, even beyond those way stations.
Oh yeah, the more you normalize them, the more frequently they
the more
occur.
you normalize them, the more then you are trapped by that normalization by yourself. So these should be only taken as confirmations that the universe, the cosmos, God is confirming your your process, this alchemical process that is happening within you in your spiritual path. These are just confirmations that you're on the right path, and just don't get taken by the scenery. Keep going until you get to the final destination. So this is how this should be taken. And so when people experience these sorts of phenomena, I don't dismiss these phenomena as being fictional.
Which phenomenon? The monster
one that you
example.
just explained. Unless I had one particular case with this gentleman who also lived in Australia that was just obsessed, like on a very unhealthy level of obsession with being attacked by jinn. And he was living in this literally fantasy world of kind of this Lord of the Rings daily battle with these jinn coming from all kinds of different dimensions of being
yeah,
by
you
various
can become
people
psychotic if you,
to
you can go into a
make his
psychosis
life
with
a
it.
living hell. And I'm just like, man,
Yeah.
until you realize these are all your own projections, that you're just like kind of sunk into these, this own self-projection about this reality. This is going to destroy you. This is all yourself, right? And all of these maybe on one level have absolute concrete reality from that intelligible level, but from another level, they are empty and meaningless. And you are in the driver's seat you're sitting in the seat with the remote control to change the channel, as it were. So do you have the will to change the channel?
I think it's the disempowerment you're talking about, where you're just a sitting duck of all these entities all the time, rather than feeling that there's something you can shift in your permissions or your agreements.
Well, and what I have found, for example, with a lot of people who get into the occult, if their minds are not completely wired properly, the very proposition of these entities, whether they see them or not, is another question, but the very proposition of the existence of these subtle entities pushes them into a form of paranoia, where then it becomes a kind of daily Manichaean struggle between them and these entities, right?
Rather than the very energy and confidence they need to, swim through the waters becomes diminished by this anxious nervous system.
Exactly, which is why I am quite perturbed by like some of these contemporary Neo-Sufi orders, like the Naqshbandiya, the Haqqani crowd, that are just obsessed with their murids about cleanliness and keeping the jinn out of their lives, and everything they do is about keeping the jinn out. And every discourse is about jinn doing this and that, and the other thing is like someone forgot the memo that the jinn themselves are part of the stream of the truly real. And maybe they should read Ibn Arabi to understand this, especially given that they're the Naqshbandi order, who at least until about 400 years ago were very big on Ibn Arabi, because this is all beside the point. And what it's doing is erecting these unnecessary veils for the Salik, to do their suluk properly. If the jinn come, they come. So what? Let them come. Their ultimate substance is the same substance as mine. We're all part of the Nur Allah, which is attached ultimately to the levels of the essence. That he, not he dialectic is as much applicable to them as it is to me.
Mhm.
So why should I be afraid of these entities?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes that fear can be what drives. I feel like part of the function of jinn is a kind of evolutionary pressure of fear to drive people towards God and towards awakening.
Yes,
Because often I've seen people
for people
won't.
who get it, for people who get it, but
Mm.
for a lot of people, at least amongst a lot of the contemporaries that I'm seeing, that's not the case.
Yeah, well, that's why you have to be very careful in the way it's discussed, because otherwise you can just put people into a fear state
Yeah,
and make things worse.
very much.
Lastly, have you seen the Never-Ending Story, the original?
Have I what?
The Never-Ending Story.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's what came to mind when you're talking about the Fantasia. It's like everything that humans have ever imagined. It's like that dimension that exists.
Yes.
Yeah. And I always kind of struggled. I pondered that many times because but
And
I do
just like
like
I
it.
said, that never ending story then ruptures into the real world at some point as well,
Yeah.
So these things happen. Whoever wrote that story was a genius and had definite
Oh yeah.
experience and taste of this reality for
Oh,
sure.
it's very esoteric. Yeah.
Yeah, very esoteric. Yeah.
I have a brief question and then I have kind of a rambling comment.
Sure.
At the very beginning I think you said that anyone who proposes hylomorphism, that commits them to a wahdat al-wujud position.
Reverse
hylomorphism. Yeah. I just wasn't sure why.
Where matter precedes form. Yeah.
Right. But I'm
Yeah.
not sure why that would be the case, because you could identify wujud with form.
Only if form is taken as infinite extension, but that's not what quiddity is. And that's not what even any concept of surah, even if we take it from the Indian perspective, when they talk about these term Purusha Prakriti, the form that corresponds to it is not infinite extension, but universal matter is infinite extension. And this is where this whole hylomorphism, Aristotelian standard hylomorphic model is a bit confusing at times, and why some of these early Ismaili theosophers and then later the Sheikhi school, I think, approach this question properly, because if you are talking about quiddity's isala, its primacy, then the issue of the extent of infinite extension of matter is not properly resolved if it is then logically the antecedent to that form, right? I think Sheikh Ahmed Ahsai clearly resolved this point. However, I see the echoes of this very same argument within Ibn Arabi himself. I mean, which is extremely ironic, since Sheikh Ahmed had it in for Ibn Arabi. But this particular argument of reverse hylomorphism, where the universal matter, hayula, logically precedes the instantiations that proceed from it, appears to be echoed by Ibn Arabi himself. And this infinite extension of the universal matter that is animate, and its instantiations being the various quiddities or the forms of nature, the natural forms, is a salat al-wujudi kind of perspective, rather than the opposite. And I think one of the reasons why you have the later Akbarian school, beginning with Qanawi on up, even, just before Mullah Sadra, or even to some degree Mullah Sadra. The Mullah Sadra is kind of a fence sitter, because he says certain things about matter, form, and extension that on the one hand seem to comment his teacher Mir Damat, who was a exponent of the Salat al-Mahiyya, but then kind of shifts in certain areas when he's discussing the same thing in his Asfara Arba'a that seem to suggest a kind of a reverse alomorphic template without really coming out. But Sheikh Ahmad Asai outright, put this position down as his ontology on matter. I've had this discussion with a couple of these Hosavis who have actually read the Sheikhi text, and they seem to agree. They think there's something there, that there is a agreement on this particular question. And then when we're talking about the unicity of being in its reflections on the realm of universal nature, where the universal matter makes its debut, then it seems to correspond better to this ontology than the reverse possession, where the form precedes the matter logically.
Okay, all right. I'll think about that some more. This whole thing brings up the question of, and I think you kind of mentioned it, of naturalism. I was reading one of Idris Hamid's essays yesterday on naturalism and Shi'i cosmology, and it just made me. I've just been thinking a lot about it, and one of the questions I had was, could we attribute something like that to Ibn al-Arabi?
Absolutely. Yes, we can. I know the essay you're talking about too. It's a very good one. Yeah, most definitely we can.
Yeah. I mean, I still have questions about. I'm still like looking into what even naturalism is. It seems like there's no like agreed upon definition of it. But I think one of the things you mentioned is a feature of naturalism, which is that there's no strict divide between spirit and body, which is just coming from like a Neoplatonic peripatetic way of thinking. That's just it's so wild to think that way. But
yes, yeah.
But also I was thinking that the whole doctrine of this imagination is like non-delimited imagination that you have in Ibn al-Arabi, and maybe we could say the same about Suhrawardi also. Like, I was thinking that imagination seems to also be connected to naturalism, or it could be, because it's a place where bodies and spirits come together.
Oh, yes. Exactly. Yeah. 100% agree about that. And that's why the concept of nature in itself then becomes one of those ankarat munkarat, those undefinables, because within nature, especially if you do suluk in nature, where matter and spirit begin and end becomes undefinable. You don't know where one ends and one begins. If you've sat in a forest and just meditated for a couple of hours and just allowed your own mind to still and then just observe that environment, where is the spirit and where's the matter containing it? These two become kind of blurred, these two boundaries. And so nature, universal nature, as encompassing both the spiritual, the unseen, and the seen simultaneously, is a perfect way to express this. But like you said, within the standard, peripatetic Neoplatonic context, this proposition is a little bit problematic, except when we're looking at some of the works of Proclus, who has this kind of naturalist and edge to him. But what we mean by naturalism is a very different concept of naturalism than, say, some of the Western philosophers of the contemporary period use naturalism, because our naturalism is built on a holarchy of being that is graded. That whole tashkik al-wujud, the gradation within being, is very much present within this concept of naturalism, whereas with many contemporary philosophers of naturalism, that is completely not present, nor do they have any kind of an ontological axiom about their naturalism, or develop one anyway. So that is the difference between this kind of naturalism and this other kind of naturalism. Because I've had this conversation. I've mentioned this, that there's Ibn Arabi's a naturalism. They're like, what do you mean? How can that be? and then you explain it to them, and then say, okay, and then they realize that the naturalism that they subscribe to is actually not a very sophisticated philosophical form of naturalism at all. I would argue that in Europe, a figure like Jacob Boehme also has this, Neoplatonized kind of naturalism at the same time. This has been commented by people who have worked on Boehme, that he has this kind of naturalist edge to him in a very Neoplatonized way. So he's very, very similar to us and Ibn Arabi in that regard.
What is naturalism?
Oh God, it's one of those undefinable concepts in philosophy. I mean, look, we could take let's take the Western definition of naturalism, because this is a good point, because ours does disagree with this different naturalism. Okay. Here's a basic Oxford dictionary, and there's one naturalism from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Let me see if I can bring this one up first. The term naturalism has no very precise meaning in contemporary philosophy. Its current usage derives from debates in America in the first half of the last century. The self-proclaimed naturalists from that period, John Dewey, Ernest Nagel, Sidney Hook, and Roy Wood, Sellers. These ain't blah, blah, blah. Some understood naturalism is not particularly informative term as blah, blah, blah. Okay, give me a definition. So in art and architecture, a style and theory of representation based on the accurate depiction of detail. The philosophical belief that everything arises from natural properties and causes, and supernatural or spiritual explanations are excluded or discounted. And this is where
That's funny.
we completely diverge from the Western naturalism, is because our naturalism does in fact hold the metaphysical, paranormal, supernatural, and spiritual element in it. In fact, this form of Islamic Neoplatonism is validating the existence of these things within a naturalist context, because nature itself is seen as being graded in hierarchies of being, right? So that is the difference between the naturalism of the East, and I would probably even put the Chinese and the Japanese, various schools of Zen and Taoism in this camp of naturalism that we're a part of, whereas the Western naturalism is seeking to explain naturalism from a prism of philosophical materialism.
It sounds like rational materialism.
Yes, yeah, that's what it is. Yeah.
So they're definitely in the minority there, because nobody else accepts that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I say supernatural is like, it's supernatural, like it's uber natural.
No, this is a
not
different. This is a completely theocentric form of naturalism, and nature itself would be then looked upon as a theomorphism, a form of God. Okay, within layers and infinite layers of the emanation and the forms of God in everything else and on other levels of being.
And it seems that the whole scientific paradigm, I mean, I'm a scientist myself, but it seems that the whole scientific paradigm is sitting in the naturalism, rational materialism camp.
Yeah.
It's behind a lot
One
of
is
problems.
I mean, the way that Ken Wilber puts it in one of his books that he published back in the 90s. He says that this conflict between naturalists is, because he also puts himself in the kind of a Neoplatonic natural camp. He says it's the conflict between the ascenders and the descenders. The ascenders being one who want to see the source of the nature as being participant in the nature, while the descenders only want to look at the outcome and don't want to look back at the source of this naturalism, right?
Yeah.
And I think he's right about that. because Western naturalism is a branch of Western secular materialism.
Yeah.
Whereas the naturalism of the East and this kind of Islamic philosophy and mysticism is very much looking at God as you know, as the source of the nature and as the present agent within it.
Well, it just sounds like the unity of being to me. Then
Exactly.
that, yeah.
That's it. Boom. Yeah.
The West is very pathological in that way by its own definition, because something pathological is described as, you know, like say in psychiatry, it's whatever the majority experiences and has a consensus about reality is the normal thing. And then what the minority experiences is a pathological thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the West is by its own definitions pathological because the majority of humanity has a consensus around these quite mundane supernatural things.
I have been saying this stuff since my college days in the 90s. And there are even a lot of people, many Westerners, white people that completely agree with this. One way to look at it, I mean, look, I'm no friend to the church, but let's give credit where credit is due. With the European Enlightenment of the 17th, 18th century, when this entire, you know, where entire context of discourse were basically thrown out and burnt. And they decided that we were just going to start on a blank slate and just conceive an entire new language to talk about the world. This did a number on the minds and the whole, you know, the whole soul, the collective soul of the world. This was like almost a act of violence upon it, especially when it extended itself, because the church, for all of its political and social ills, had conceived of a language of talking about the world, whether in its scholastic, theological, or philosophical, or scientific context, that had placed God at the center of the universe, right? Irrespective of whether you agree or disagree with what the political power of the church does or doesn't do. But the minute this was all chucked out, then you're basically left with a naked human subject that is now kind of grappling in the dark, trying to figure out his way around things. And 200, 300 years later, they still haven't figured it out. And they're still coming with ways to try to define things that earlier civilizations had defined in a much more multifaceted and, in my opinion, precise way that empowered these civilizations to deal with their environment and the world in a much better and holistic way than this civilization that has arisen since the Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment. Yeah.
But by their own logic, atheism doesn't even make sense.
Of course not.
That's the thing, because atheists can't explain the value of life. If I say, if your friend comes to you and says he wants to end his life, what's your argument about the value of life? And that's where they get stuck.
Yeah.
They'll just say things like, well, life just is, or it just, you know, but I mean, it is a necessary reaction to the insanity of where the church went, I think, you know. But,
yeah, on one level, I mean, no disagreement at all. But then the proposal, you know, took a completely radically opposite kind of turn that then became just completely destructive and has led us to this point now, where since the 1960s, we've had this massive explosion of mental illness because of these confusions, because the bearings, the cultural railings that used to exist within each of these cultures no longer exists.
Do you think also, sorry.
Go for it.
Do you think, I mean, I have a theory that when I look at traditional cultures where knowledge is orally passed down, there are elders who have to decide whether people are ready to receive that information. Whereas since the sort of 1960s, you know, I mean, there was the printing press, obviously, before that, but then you had this sort of all this occult information available in print. And now there is no assessment of one's readiness. So you can be, I don't know, 16 and go and start digging into whatever, you know, Crowley. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. And I have a theory that that's it's created a lot of instability where there's just no
Well, I
this
mean,
knowledge was guarded for a reason. So you could
sure,
on one side, but on the other side you could argue for it
sure.
as a good thing. What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's not even about the occult. It's about all kinds of other things. It's,
Mm.
I mean, print media, at least in the way that it emerges in the 20th century, I think to some degree kind of began this trend, but everything has radically changed since the emergence of the internet, where
Yeah.
this accessibility, there are no guardrails of any sort towards the accessibility of knowledge towards anyone. If you can get online, you can access whatever it is that you want. And we are beginning to see that this may not have been the best of outcomes. Whereas previously, I mean, during my generation, if you wanted information, you went to the public library, and if they had whatever information you sought, they retrieved it. If they didn't, they would try to get it from another library and on. But now that whole system is redundant. Libraries still exist, physical libraries, but their function has now become more of an ornamental thing and more of a warehousing of certain items than what it once was. So to get back to your question, on the one hand, this explosion of information that we've had, has been good in itself, but the usages by which this explosion of information have been put have not been all that great. Now, whether to solve this problem, we have to curtail the internet is not somewhere that I think we should even go at the moment. Although I do believe that the internet needs to be taken out of the hands of the corporations and the plutocrats. But this is the case. It does seem to indicate that putting everything in front of everyone is not the best of possible worlds.
Maybe we shouldn't have taught everyone to read.
Well,
Internet's
I wouldn't go there.
No, I'm joking.
I wouldn't quite go there, but if there is no preparedness, we don't even have to use the metaphysical language. If you have, half cooked something and then throw whatever other ingredients that have to go into this dish, then this dish is going to come out not as well as if this thing was prepared properly, at the right temperature, right times, you take out the item, all that kind of stuff. So information in a sense is like that. And having information accessible to 5-year-olds or 10-year-olds that they shouldn't be encountering until they're a little bit older and mature, I think is a wise way of doing things.
I'm talking specifically about magic, really.
And this includes the occult. Okay, this also includes the occult. Yes. Obviously. One thing that I have observed over the last 20, 30 years online is that, especially the last 20, is that by and large, a lot of people that are getting attracted to the occult are either mentally unhinged or are not fully individuated or
looking for power.
Or have been disempowered by some kind of experience. They're seeking an alternative means to solve their personal problems via the occult. And these, in my opinion, are some of the worst possible reasons to enter the usage of this occult technology. Because in previous civilizations and in previous times, you approached the occult when you had made some level of progress in your spiritual path. And then your teacher, whatever, would put this sort of information in front of you as kind of like the expansion into the next level, the more practical element of the knowledge that you've gained. Yeah. Anybody else?
Sidi, I would like to one or two questions. The first one, the ayah which was quoted the question of Allah Ta'ala to Isa alayhi salam, are you the one who said, take me and my mother as two separate gods besides Allah? That don't know if it is true, but based on this ayah, some say that the original Trinity, it is not the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but it is the Father, the Mother, which is
Son.
the mother of
Yeah.
Isa, and
Yeah.
he's the Son. But
Yeah.
because of the misogynist tendencies which were in the Middle Age, they put out the mother and replace it with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think that the Quran may be echoing some non-mainstream form of the Trinity that would have existed perhaps among some of these Christian sects of the Arabia, because yeah, you know, for the Quran to say that these Christians are putting Mary and Jesus besides God, not this the way that the Quran even phrases this and the way that then Ibn Arabi deals with it is very interesting, very subtle. The complaint is that they are, or at least from the Wujudi perspective, the complaint is that they are putting gods besides, right? So they are juxtaposing rather than, so they are, you know, they're kind of in a position of negation rather than affirmation of Jesus and his mother. Whereas if they had been a little bit more finessed in the way that they had expressed the godhood or divinity of Mary and Jesus, then perhaps there wouldn't be an objection. But anyway, these are philosophical speculations. Nevertheless, what the Quran, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of people who kind of noticed this, is that it is very possible that we are dealing with a very interesting early Christian notion of the Trinity that was rejected by these, you know, these patriarchal establishments of the Church of the West and the East at the time of the rise of Islam. This is why even you know, this issue about whether Jesus was crucified or not in the Quran appears to be a Christian Gnostic Docetist polemic against the Christology of the Church, right? Several people have noticed this about several of these underlying narratives about Christianity that exist in the Quran, that in kind of in a very surreptitious way, the Quran took the cause of some of these Gnostic groups, perhaps Nestorians or other versions of these Gnostic groups, and became its champion within the text of the Quran. This has been debated by many different, you know, scholars in this field about this. Yeah, which I find extremely interesting. But, you know, Corban was picking this stuff up about 50, 60, 70 years ago in his own studies. When, you know, he was then making these comparisons, coming at it from his own phenomenological perspective, noticing, you know, these, you know, very pronounced Gnostic narratives that are jumping right out of the Quran.
But
The
sorry,
next,
I had a question, sorry,
okay.
but I'll leave it to the end, sorry.
Okay, that's that.
Okay, the next one, the two names, which again are in the same ayah mentioned, to me quite similar in the meaning, but can you elaborate little more the Shaheed and the Raqib?
Raqib,
What is the meaning of these two?
The Raqib, in the context that Ibn Arabi is using it in this particular chapter, is a watcher, as a muraqib, as someone who watches, right? Whereas Raqib can also be taken in the sense of someone or something that competes against you or surpasses you. But in this context, he is using it in the same sense of the word muraqib, someone who is watching or watchful over something. And he ties the Raqib in this context to the Shahid. So that then what Austin is doing in this translation, he's translating one as the witness and the other one as the watcher. Whereas in this, I would have taken the word Raqib and translated in this particular passage as the protector rather than the watcher, right? By virtue of that kind of definition that is being used.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome. Vanessa.
Yeah, you're talking about the Trinity. As far as I'm aware, the Jews have the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about early forms of, that it was like a Christian thing that was rejected. Sorry, I'm not doing justice to what you said, but could you help me understand how the Jewish Holy Spirit might have, could it have continued into Islam?
Yes.
In its original form?
Yes, absolutely. And it's even mentioned in its Islamic form. The concept of the Shekinah, however, it's developed later in the Kabbalah. Yet the word itself, Shekinah, occurs in a weird kind of way in the Songs of Solomon. Now, whether Solomon authored these Songs of Solomon or not is an academic debate. But yet we have the concept of the Shekinah. And in the Quran, the Sakina appears several times. And it is made synonymous with the Ruh al-Amin, which is the Holy Spirit, which is Gabriel. Right? And this concept was already existing in some form, whether in the first, second centuries of the Common Era is debatable, but we see evidence of this kind of formulation within Jewish spirituality in the early centuries of the diaspora, that they were articulating these sorts of ideas. So that this Ruh al-Amin, or the Shekinah of God, was the spirit that was with the Israelites, for example, when they took the Exodus out of Egypt. It was there when Moses had his first experience of God, which was actually the Shekinah and not the Godhead. And this Shekinah often makes appearances as the archangel Metatron, which was its angelophany, whereas in Islam it is Gabriel. Does that answer your question?
It does. There's more I could ask about, but I'll save it for another lifetime.
Anybody else? Okay. Next week, we're going to start on this chapter of Solomon. This is going to also be 2 sessions for the chapter of Solomon, and the zikr associated with it is the zikr of Ya Rahman, O Merciful. And so we'll leave it here for this week and come back together same time next week. Everybody have a great week, and Ya Nabil.